Something happened in 1953. That much is agreed upon. But what exactly happened, and whether the version of events that entered the historical record was accurate, is a question that has never been fully settled. Most people who encountered this story accepted it. They had no particular reason not to. It was presented through official channels, supported by documentation, and circulated in the kind of language that signals authority and finality. So people moved on. The story was filed. The case, in most minds, was closed. But closing a case and resolving it are two different things. And in this situation, those two things may have been quietly confused. For decades, the 1953 account sat largely undisturbed. It appeared in reference books. It was cited in reports. It became part of the background understanding of a particular moment in history. One of those facts that people repeat without thinking too carefully about where it came from or how it was confirmed. That kind of unchallenged acceptance is not unusual in history. Many events from that era were documented once, confirmed through official channels, and then treated as settled. The systems of verification that existed at the time were not always thorough. They were trusted, but trust and thoroughness are not the same thing. The question is whether that trust was warranted in this case, and the more carefully the record is examined, the less certain the answer becomes. What makes this particular story worth examining is not the claim that someone deliberately lied. Deliberate falsehoods exist in history, but they are not the only way a misleading record gets created. Sometimes events are described accurately in their surface details, but framed in ways that shift their meaning. Sometimes key information is simply left out, not hidden dramatically, but quietly set aside, considered unimportant or inconvenient. Sometimes the people responsible for creating the official account were themselves working from incomplete information and didn't know what they were missing. Any of these possibilities could apply here, and that is part of what makes the 1953 account so difficult to evaluate. It is not a simple question of true or false. It is a question of how the story was assembled, and whether the assembled version reflects what actually occurred. One of the more notable aspects of this case is how little resistance the account generated when it first appeared. That is worth pausing on. Most significant events, especially those with political or historical weight, attract at least some degree of skepticism at the time of their reporting. People ask questions. Alternative explanations are proposed. Journalists or investigators look at the edges of the story to see if anything doesn't fit. That process, imperfect as it is, usually leaves some trace in the record. Debates get documented. Dissenting voices appear somewhere. Even if the official version ultimately wins, the friction of its acceptance tends to be visible. In this case, that friction is almost entirely absent. The story was not debated. It was not seriously challenged in public. It entered the record with a smoothness that, on reflection, is slightly unusual. And that smoothness is itself a piece of information, though what exactly it tells us is not immediately clear. It is worth thinking carefully about what smooth acceptance actually means. There are at least two ways to interpret it. The first interpretation is straightforward. The story was accepted because it was accurate. It was well documented, credibly sourced, and presented in a way that gave people no reasonable basis for doubt. In this reading, the lack of challenge reflects the quality of the account, not a problem with it. The second interpretation is more uncomfortable. In this reading, the story was accepted not because it was clearly true, but because the conditions of the time made questioning it difficult. The year 1953 existed within a specific political and social environment. Information was managed carefully. Official sources carried enormous authority, and the public had been, for several years, accustomed to receiving certain kinds of news through certain kinds of channels and treating that news as reliable. In that environment, a story that arrived through official channels, with the right documentation attached, would face very little resistance, regardless of how accurately it reflected events. Both interpretations are possible. That uncertainty has never been resolved. The idea that a story could arrive already complete, already sealed, as the phrase goes, is one that deserves some attention. Most accounts of real events, as they enter the record, carry some roughness. Witnesses give slightly different versions. Documents from different departments don't align perfectly. The timeline has gaps that need to be explained. These imperfections are the normal texture of real events Because real events are complicated and involve multiple people, each with their own perspective and limited information. When a story lacks that texture, when it arrives with all its elements already in agreement, all its sources pointing in the same direction, all its details fitting together without visible effort, the absence of roughness becomes notable. It does not prove that anything is wrong, but it raises a question that is difficult to set aside. How did this account become so clean? There are honest explanations for a clean account. Events that are planned and documented in advance tend to produce cleaner records than events that happen unexpectedly. Events involving a small number of people in controlled circumstances tend to leave more consistent documentation than events involving many people in chaotic conditions. If the 1953 event fits one of those descriptions, the cleanliness of the account might simply reflect the nature of what occurred. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the event in question was not, based on what is known, the kind of small, controlled, pre-documented event that naturally produces clean records. It involved complexity. It involved multiple parties. It had implications that extended beyond a single moment or location. Events of that type, in that era, almost always left a more complicated trail. The fact that this one didn't is not easy to explain. Another element that draws attention is the absence of any significant independent investigation at the time. In cases where official accounts are accurate and well supported, independent investigators who look into them typically reach the same conclusions, or close to them. The investigation might not be extensive, but it exists, and its findings reinforce the official record. In the 1953 case, that reinforcement is largely missing. It is not that investigators looked at the account and found it credible. It is that the account was not seriously investigated from the outside at all. The official version stood on its own, supported by official sources, and the normal process of external verification that might have added confidence to the record simply did not occur in any visible or documented form. This raises questions, not dramatic ones, but quiet, persistent ones. Why wasn't more scrutiny applied? Was the story considered too settled to examine? Was there some other reason that independent investigation was limited? None of those questions have been answered clearly, and unanswered questions about the process of verification are, themselves, a reason to look more carefully at what the verification actually involved. It is also worth considering what gets lost when a story is accepted too quickly. Every time a historical account is taken at face value without thorough examination, the window for effective questioning gets narrower. Witnesses move on or are no longer available. Documents are stored, reclassified, or in some cases simply disappear. The people who had direct knowledge of events age, and their ability or willingness to add to the record diminishes over time. This is not unique to the 1953 case. It happens with many historical events, but it matters here because the questions that could most effectively be answered through direct investigation are the ones that become hardest to address as time passes. If there were gaps in the original account, things that should have been examined but weren't, those gaps become more difficult to close with each passing decade. At this point, a significant amount of time has elapsed. Whatever could have been learned through investigation at the time has become considerably harder to recover. The record that exists is largely the one that was created in 1953 and the years immediately following, a record with the specific characteristics and specific gaps already described. What this chapter is not arguing is that the 1953 story was definitely false. That would be a conclusion, and the evidence does not currently support a conclusion in either direction. What it is pointing toward is something more basic, that the story deserves more careful examination than it has typically received, and that the reasons it has not received that examination are themselves part of what makes it interesting. A story that is accurate, well-documented, and honestly reported should be able to withstand scrutiny. Its records should be internally consistent. Its sources should align. Its acceptance should be explicable not just through authority, but through evidence. If the 1953 account is everything it was presented to be, a closer look should confirm that. The record should hold up. But if it doesn't hold up, if closer examination reveals the inconsistencies, gaps, and unexplained smoothness that early signs suggest, then the question of what actually happened in 1953 becomes significantly more complicated. And the question of why the official version was so readily accepted becomes just as important as the question of whether it was accurate. That is where this investigation begins, not with a conclusion, not with a predetermined answer, but with a simple observation. Something happened in 1953. A story was told about it, and that story was accepted with remarkable ease. The ease itself is a question, and questions, when they are the right ones, have a way of leading somewhere. Where this one leads is still unclear, but the starting point is the story, and the particular, notable way that it was sealed. The official explanation of the 1953 event is, on its surface, straightforward. That is precisely how it has always been presented, as something settled, confirmed, and not requiring further examination. When you read the official account, it moves in a clear direction. There is a beginning. There is a development. There is a conclusion. Each part connects to the next without visible difficulty. And that structure, that sense of organized clarity, is part of what made the account so easy to accept. It felt complete. It felt finished. It felt like the kind of explanation that had been carefully assembled from reliable sources and verified before being released. But feeling complete and being complete are two different things. And that distinction is worth keeping in mind as the official version is examined more carefully. According to the accepted account, a specific development took place in 1953. The precise nature of that development was confirmed, or described as confirmed, by authorities who were considered credible at the time. It was recorded by official bodies. It moved through trusted channels. The language used to describe it carried the tone of certainty. Words like confirmed, verified, and documented appeared in the surrounding materials. These are words that signal the end of a process of investigation, not the beginning of one. They tell the reader that the checking has already been done, that the questions have already been asked and answered, and that what remains is simply the final record. That framing is important, because once something is described as confirmed and documented through official channels, the natural response is to stop questioning it. The work of verification appears to have already been completed. There seems to be no remaining task for the outside observer except to accept what has been established. This raises a question that is easy to overlook. Who exactly did the confirming, and through what process? To understand the environment in which this confirmation took place, it is necessary to think about what 1953 actually looked like from the inside. The world at that moment was shaped by a particular kind of tension. The Cold War was not new, but it was deepening. The major powers on opposing sides were engaged in a continuous, careful competition, not always through direct confrontation, but through information, perception, and control of the public narrative. In that environment, governments did not simply report events. They managed them. Information was a tool, and it was treated as such. What reached the public was not always a straightforward reflection of what had occurred. It was a version of events, sometimes accurate, sometimes adjusted, and sometimes constructed from the available pieces in whatever arrangement best served the interests of the moment. This was not unique to one side. Multiple governments across different political systems operated with the same basic understanding. That information needed to be controlled, shaped, and released in ways that supported broader objectives. The press, in most countries, operated within these constraints to varying degrees. Journalists worked with what they were given. Independent verification was difficult. Access to primary sources was limited. This was the atmosphere in which the 1953 account was produced. That doesn't automatically mean the account was false, but it does mean the conditions under which it was created were not neutral ones. Within this atmosphere, the process of official confirmation worked in a specific way. An event would occur, or be described as occurring. An official body would issue a statement. Other official bodies would reference that statement. The press would report the statement, and the statement, having been reported, would then be cited as evidence of its own accuracy. This is a circular process. It is not entirely unreliable. Sometimes the original event was accurately described, and the circular confirmation simply reinforced something true. But the circularity means that a constructed account, one that did not accurately reflect events, could move through exactly the same process and produce exactly the same kind of documented record. The 1953 account followed this process. Officials confirmed it. Agencies referenced the confirmation. The press reported the confirmation as though the confirmation itself was the evidence, and the record was closed. At first, this seems like a normal chain of verification, but there is a problem. At no point in that chain does independent evidence necessarily enter. At no point does someone outside the official system examine the original claim from the ground up. The role of the press during this period deserves particular attention. Journalism in 1953 operated under conditions that were significantly different from what most people today would expect. Access to information was narrower. The relationship between major news organizations and government sources was, in many cases, closer than it would later become. Reporters depended on official sources for access. Official sources depended on reporters for the distribution of their preferred narratives. It was a relationship with mutual benefits, and those benefits shaped what got reported and how. This does not mean the press was dishonest in any simple sense. Most journalists of that era believed they were reporting accurately. They were working with the information available to them, through the channels available to them, under the pressures of their particular professional environment. But belief in accuracy and actual accuracy are not the same thing. A reporter can sincerely report what they have been told, while the thing they have been told remains unverified at its source. In the 1953 case, the press reported the official account. It circulated. It was read. And because it appeared in credible publications through credible reporters, it gained an additional layer of apparent verification, even though the underlying evidence had not been independently examined. There is something else worth noting about the timing of this account. The year 1953 was a significant one in terms of the broader political landscape. Several major developments were occurring simultaneously across different parts of the world. Attention was divided. Governments were managing multiple narratives at once. The public, receiving information through limited channels, could not easily track everything that was happening at the same time. In a crowded information environment, individual stories receive less scrutiny than they might in quieter periods. A claim that might prompt extended examination in normal circumstances can pass through the record quickly when there are many competing claims demanding attention at the same time. Whether this dynamic affected the reception of the 1953 account is not certain, but the timing created conditions in which a story, even one with unexamined foundations, could move through the public record with relatively little friction. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about the environment. But the environment matters when evaluating how and why an account was accepted. Looking at the structure of the official explanation itself, one thing becomes clear fairly quickly. The account is organized around conclusions rather than around evidence. It tells you what happened. It identifies who confirmed it. It provides the names of the institutions involved. But it moves quickly past the question of how those conclusions were reached and what specific evidence they were based on. This structure is not unusual for official communications of that era. Governments did not typically publish detailed methodologies alongside their public statements. They issued findings, not processes. The expectation was that the authority of the issuing institution would carry the necessary weight. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because an account organized around conclusions, without visible methodology, is one that is very hard to evaluate from the outside. You can see what was claimed. You cannot easily see how the claim was supported. And when you cannot see the supporting structure, you also cannot identify where that structure might be weak. Some researchers who have looked at this case argue that the official explanation, whatever its accuracy, was presented in a way that made challenge practically difficult. The language was authoritative. The sources were official. The record was filed and closed. To question it required not just doubt, but access to alternative evidence. And that access, in 1953 and in the years immediately following, was extremely limited for anyone outside the official system. Others disagree with this interpretation. They argue that the official explanation was accepted because it was credible, and that the absence of challenge reflects the strength of the account rather than any structural barrier to questioning it. In this view, looking for hidden problems in a straightforwardly confirmed event is itself the problem, a tendency to find mystery where there is simply history. Both positions exist. Both have been argued seriously, and neither has fully resolved the underlying question of what the official confirmation actually rested on. What the official version does successfully is create a sense of completion. It answers the most basic questions: what, when, who confirmed it, in a way that feels satisfying. It moves forward without pausing over its own gaps. It presents itself as the end of the story rather than one version of it. And for most people, most of the time, that presentation was sufficient. The story arrived, was accepted, and became part of the historical background. But sufficiency is not the same as accuracy. A story can be sufficient, meaning it satisfies the immediate need for an explanation, while still leaving important questions unaddressed beneath the surface. The 1953 official account may fall into exactly this category. It answered enough questions to stop most people from asking more. But the questions it didn't answer, the gaps it moved past without acknowledgement, the evidence it described as confirmed without showing the confirmation, those things did not disappear simply because the record was closed. They remained. Quietly, beneath the clean surface of the official explanation, they remained. And this is precisely where the difficulty begins. Not in a dramatic revelation, not in a sudden discovery that overturns everything, but in the slow recognition that an explanation which always felt complete may have been, in certain important ways, constructed to feel that way, rather than actually being that way. Whether that recognition leads anywhere meaningful is a question that cannot be answered here. What can be said is that the official explanation, examined carefully, raises more questions than it appears to on first reading. Clean explanations from complicated periods rarely stay clean under close attention. And this one, despite its organized surface, is no exception. The examination is just beginning. The first problem with the official account is not the kind that announces itself. It does not arrive with a dramatic contradiction or a single document that clearly exposes something wrong. It is quieter than that. It appears slowly, in the spaces between records, in the small differences between one official source and another. And that quietness is part of what makes it so difficult to address. Loud problems attract attention. Quiet ones tend to be set aside, explained away, or simply missed by anyone not looking carefully enough. But quiet problems do not disappear because they are ignored. They stay in the record, waiting. The process that brought these problems to light was not designed to find them. Researchers who began examining the 1953 documentation were not, in most cases, approaching the material with suspicion. They were doing the kind of work that historians and archival researchers regularly do: cross-referencing documents, checking figures against other sources, building a more complete picture of a period by comparing everything available. This is standard methodology. It is not accusatory. It is simply careful. And yet, in the process of doing that careful work, something unexpected emerged. Certain details within the 1953 record did not align the way they should have. Not in every document, and not across every element of the account, but in specific places, when two or more official sources describing the same event were placed side by side. The descriptions did not fully match. The differences were not always large, but they were there, and their presence raised a question that was difficult to set aside once it had been noticed. To understand why these discrepancies matter, it helps to think about how official documentation is supposed to work. When a significant event is recorded by official bodies, there is an expectation of consistency across sources. This is not an unreasonable expectation. It is, in fact, the basic standard of reliable documentation. If an event occurred in a specific way, at a specific time, involving specific details, then different official records of that event, produced by different departments or agencies within the same system, should reflect those specifics in broadly the same way. Minor variations are acceptable. Different departments use different language. Clerical processes vary. The level of detail in one report may differ from the level of detail in another. These kinds of surface differences are normal and expected. They do not, by themselves, indicate a problem with the underlying account. But the variations found in the 1953 documentation were not surface differences. They were not a matter of language choice or level of detail. They appeared in the core elements, the figures, the timelines, the descriptions of what specifically occurred. These are precisely the elements that should be most consistent across sources, because they are the elements that would have been most carefully confirmed before being committed to the official record. Consider what it means for a timeline to vary across official documents. A timeline is not a matter of interpretation. An event either occurred at one point or another. If two official records from the same period describe the same event as occurring at different times, not slightly different, but meaningfully different, then at least one of those records contains an inaccuracy. Either the error was introduced during the recording process, or one of the records was working from information that was not accurate to begin with. Both explanations are possible. Neither is particularly reassuring. A recording error in a routine administrative document is one thing. A recording error in a document describing a significant, officially confirmed event is something that requires more explanation. These are the kinds of records that, in principle, would have been reviewed before filing. They would have passed through multiple hands. The expectation of accuracy would have been higher, not lower. And yet, the timeline variations exist. Which version was correct is not always clear, and that lack of clarity is itself a problem that the official record has never fully resolved. The same issue appears with figures. When numbers associated with the 1953 event are compared across sources, they do not always match. Again, the differences are not always enormous. But figures, even more than timelines, are not a matter of interpretation. A number either is what it is, or it is wrong. When different official documents present different figures for the same element of the same event, the question of which figure is accurate has a definite answer, but that answer is not always findable in the record itself. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because in a well-maintained official record, figures are the easiest things to verify. They can be checked against primary sources. They can be confirmed through multiple channels. They are, by their nature, precise. The fact that they vary across 1953 documentation suggests either that the verification process was less thorough than the language of the account implied, or that different parts of the official system were working from different sets of information. Either of those possibilities is worth taking seriously. At first, it seems normal to attribute these inconsistencies to the general administrative conditions of the era. Records from the early 1950s were not managed with the same tools and systems available later. Coordination between departments was slower. Information traveled through more steps before reaching its final form. Errors introduced early in that process could persist through the chain without being caught. This is a reasonable explanation, and it accounts for many of the documentation problems found in records from that period. But there's a problem with applying this explanation uniformly to the 1953 case. The inconsistencies do not appear evenly across the documentation. They are not scattered randomly through the record in the way that general administrative error would predict. Instead, they cluster. They appear most consistently in specific areas, the areas corresponding to the core claims of the official account. The peripheral details, the background information, the contextual elements, these tend to be more consistent. It is the central facts that vary. That pattern does not fit the profile of ordinary administrative error. Ordinary error is not selective. It does not concentrate itself in the most important parts of a record while leaving the less important parts intact. Some researchers have pointed to this clustering as one of the more significant features of the documentation problem. If inconsistencies appeared randomly, they could be explained through general record-keeping failures. But inconsistencies that appear specifically where the most important verification would have been concentrated suggest something different. They suggest that the parts of the account requiring the most careful support were, for some reason, the parts with the least stable documentation. Why that would be the case is not immediately clear. One explanation is that the core claims were more difficult to verify accurately, and the instability in the record reflects genuine uncertainty at the time of documentation. Another explanation is that different parts of the official system were supplied with different versions of the core information, that the inconsistency in the record reflects an inconsistency in what was being communicated internally. A third possibility is that the documentation was assembled under time pressure, and the central details were recorded less carefully than the surrounding context. None of these explanations has been confirmed. All of them remain possibilities, and the inability to determine which one is accurate is itself part of the ongoing problem with the 1953 record. There is another dimension to this issue that deserves attention. In most cases where documentation inconsistencies are discovered in historical records, there is some process by which they are eventually addressed. Archivists compare sources. Historians identify the discrepancy and note it in their work. Official bodies, when the inconsistencies are significant enough, issue corrections or clarifications. The record, imperfect as it may be, gets gradually refined through continued examination. In the 1953 case, that process of refinement has been notably limited. The inconsistencies that researchers identified were documented in their findings, but the official record itself was not updated or corrected. No explanation for the variations was formally issued. The documents with conflicting details remained in the archive alongside each other, unreconciled. This raises questions about the priority given to resolving the discrepancies. If the inconsistencies were minor and obviously explained by administrative error, they might reasonably be left without formal correction. But if they affect core elements of a significant official account, the absence of any formal reconciliation is harder to understand. It doesn't fully make sense that an officially confirmed account, one that was presented with the language of verification and certainty, would contain structural inconsistencies in its central details that were never formally addressed. The confirmation implied that the checking had been done, but inconsistencies in the check material suggest that checking either missed something or the material being checked was not as stable as the confirmation suggested. This is not a conclusion about what happened in 1953. It is an observation about the documentation of what happened, and the distinction matters. It is possible for an event to have occurred exactly as described while the documentation of it remains imperfect. It is also possible for an event to have been inaccurately described, with the inconsistencies in the documentation reflecting inaccuracies in the original account. The evidence available does not, at this stage, clearly distinguish between these possibilities. What it does establish is that the official record is not as solid as it was presented to be. The language of confirmation and verification implied a level of internal consistency that the documentation does not fully support. The core details, the ones that should have been most carefully established, are the ones showing the most variation, and the variations have not been explained or reconciled in any formal way. That does not prove the story was false. It proves the story was not as carefully documented as it appeared. Whether those are the same thing, or different things entirely, is a question the record cannot currently answer. And so the first quiet problem sits unresolved in the 1953 documentation. Not dramatic, not conclusive, but persistent. The kind of problem that, once noticed, is difficult to explain away entirely. The record carries inconsistencies in its most important places. Those inconsistencies have never been addressed, and the question of which version of the core facts was accurate, or whether any version was fully accurate, remains open. That openness is where the next layer of examination begins. To understand why the inconsistencies in the 1953 account matter, it is not enough to look only at the documentation itself. The documentation exists within a context. It was produced at a specific moment, under specific conditions, by people operating inside specific systems. And those systems, in the years leading up to 1953, were not functioning in the way that the word official might suggest. They were not neutral. They were not simply recording reality and releasing it. They were actively managing it. Understanding that management, how it worked, how widespread it was, and how deeply it shaped what entered the public record, is essential to evaluating what the 1953 account actually represents. The years immediately before 1953 were shaped by a particular kind of political tension. This was not the ordinary friction between governments that exists in most periods of history. It was something more structured and more deliberate. The major powers of that era were engaged in a continuous competition, not only military or economic, but informational. Each side was working to control what its own population understood about the world, and to influence what populations elsewhere believed as well. This required systems. It required organizations dedicated to the production, management, and distribution of information. And it required that those organizations operate with a level of secrecy that kept the public from understanding how much of what they were receiving had been shaped before it reached them. Those systems existed. They were not theoretical. They were funded, staffed, and active. and they operated across governments on multiple sides of the political divisions of that period. This is now a matter of historical record in many cases. Declassified documents have confirmed the existence and operation of programs that were entirely unknown to the public at the time. What those programs did, in practical terms, was create a layer between events and the public understanding of events. Something would occur. That occurrence would then pass through a process of evaluation. What should be released? What should be withheld? How should the released information be framed? What emphasis should be placed on which details? The result of that process was what the public received. This is not the same as simply lying. In many cases, the information released was factually accurate in its basic elements. But accuracy in basic elements does not mean completeness. A story can be technically true and still profoundly misleading if important context is removed, if certain details are emphasized while others are suppressed, or if the framing steers the reader toward a particular interpretation. The question, when applied to the 1953 account, is whether it went through a process of this kind before it entered the public record. And that question does not have a simple answer. Secrecy during this period operated at multiple levels. At the most visible level, governments classified information directly, designating certain documents as restricted and limiting who could access them. But there was also a less visible form of secrecy, one that is in some ways more significant. This was the secrecy around the processes themselves. Not just what decisions were made, but how they were made, by whom, and on what basis. Programs that shaped public information were not typically advertised. The people who worked within them did not announce their role. The decisions they made left limited traces in publicly accessible records. So even when researchers look carefully at the documentation from this period, they are often looking at the output of these processes, the finished, shaped version, without being able to see the process that produced it. This creates a genuine limitation for anyone trying to evaluate the 1953 account. The record that exists is the record that was allowed to exist. What was removed, adjusted, or withheld before the record was finalized is largely invisible, and invisible absences are extremely difficult to investigate. Within this environment, events were regularly shaped before they reached the public. This shaping was not always dramatic. It did not always involve large-scale falsification. More commonly, it worked through selection and emphasis. Certain elements of an event were placed at the front of the account. Others were moved to the background or omitted entirely. The result was a version of events that was not necessarily false in every detail, but was organized in a way that served particular purposes. The 1953 account fits this general pattern, not because there is definitive evidence that it was deliberately shaped in this way, but because the pattern of selection and emphasis it displays is consistent with the practices that were standard at the time. Certain details are prominent and clearly stated. Others, the ones that, based on what is known, would have been most relevant to a complete understanding, are either absent or described in ways that make them difficult to evaluate. At first, this seems like it could simply reflect the normal limitations of documentation. But there is a problem. The absences and the emphases follow a consistent direction. They do not appear randomly. They appear in ways that consistently reinforce the central claims of the official account, while consistently reducing the visibility of the elements that would raise questions about those claims. The public that received this account in 1953 was not, in most cases, in a position to evaluate it critically. This is not a comment on the intelligence or awareness of people at that time. It is a comment on the information environment they occupied. For several years leading up to 1953, the population in most countries had been receiving information through channels that were significantly controlled. They had been told what to believe about major events, and those beliefs had been reinforced repeatedly through consistent messaging across multiple outlets. In that environment, skepticism about official accounts was not a common default position. It was, in many cases, actively discouraged. Questioning official information was associated, in the political atmosphere of the early 1950s, with unreliability or worse. The social and in some cases professional costs of public doubt were real. Most people had no particular motivation to examine official accounts carefully, and some had active motivation to accept them. This does not mean the public was deceived in every case, It means the conditions for critical reception of official information were, at that moment, particularly weak. And weak conditions for critical reception make it easier for imperfect or shaped accounts to enter the record unchallenged. Some researchers who have studied this period argue that this background context is essential to any honest evaluation of the 1953 account. Their position is that you cannot assess the reliability of a document without understanding the system that produced it. And the system that produced documents in this period was one that, by design and by practice, shaped information before releasing it. To evaluate the 1953 account without accounting for this is, in their view, to ignore the most important frame of reference. Others take a different position. They argue that recognizing the general practices of an era is not sufficient evidence that any specific document from that era was shaped or manipulated. The existence of information management programs does not prove that the 1953 account passed through them. The fact that framing was common does not prove this particular account was framed. In this view, applying general historical suspicion to a specific case without specific evidence of manipulation is not rigorous investigation. It is speculation. Both of these positions are reasonable. Both have been argued seriously by people who have examined the period carefully, and neither has been able to fully answer the other. This is where the background context becomes both important and limited at the same time. It is important because it establishes that the environment in which the 1953 account was produced was one where shaping and framing were standard practice. It demonstrates that the infrastructure for producing a shaped account existed and was active. It shows that the public receiving the account was not well positioned to evaluate it critically. But it is limited because none of this directly proves what happened with the 1953 account specifically. Context establishes possibility and raises probability. It does not establish fact. And the distinction between possibility and fact is one that responsible examination has to maintain, even when the context is as suggestive as it is here. What the context does, more precisely, is add an early layer of doubt to the foundation of the story. It does not crack the foundation. It does not expose it as false, but it introduces a question about how stable that foundation actually is, and whether the confidence with which the account was presented was genuinely warranted. That question matters because the 1953 account did not exist in isolation. It was built upon, cited, and used as a reference point for other conclusions. If its foundation contains even a modest degree of instability, if the conditions under which it was produced make its reliability genuinely uncertain, then everything constructed on top of it carries that uncertainty forward. This is not a dramatic claim. It is a logical one. Documentation produced within a system that regularly shaped information, received by a public with limited capacity for critical evaluation, and filed without independent verification, carries a different level of reliability than documentation produced under more transparent conditions. Acknowledging that difference is not paranoia. It is accuracy. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because accepting the context for what it is means accepting that the 1953 account exists within a system that was, at that moment, actively managing what people knew and believed. It means acknowledging that the processes which produced the account were not designed primarily for transparency. And it means recognizing that the public acceptance of the account tells us something about the conditions of the time, but not necessarily something about the accuracy of the content. None of this resolves the question of what the 1953 account actually represents. It deepens it. The background context does not provide answers. It clarifies why the questions are harder than they first appear, and why the foundation of the official story, however solid it looked on the surface, deserves to be examined more carefully than it has been. That examination continues. As researchers began paying closer attention to the specific details of the 1953 account, something started to emerge that was difficult to categorize neatly. It was not a single large problem. There was no one moment where the official record clearly contradicted itself in a way that was impossible to explain. The problems were smaller than that. They were quieter, and in some ways, that made them harder to deal with, because small problems are easy to dismiss individually, even when they are not so easy to dismiss collectively. What was emerging was a pattern, and patterns require a different kind of attention than single contradictions do. The first category of inconsistency involved dates. In the 1953 documentation, certain dates did not align the way they should have across different parts of the official record. An event described as occurring on one date in one document was placed at a different point in time in another. These differences were not always large, sometimes a matter of days, sometimes slightly more. But dates, in official documentation, are not flexible elements. They are among the most basic and verifiable details in any record. When a date appears differently across two official documents describing the same event, one of those documents contains an error. That is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of simple logic. And the question that follows is straightforward. Which date was correct? How did the error enter the record? And why was it never formally reconciled? In most cases involving the 1953 documentation, those questions have not been answered. The conflicting dates remain in the archive, unresolved, sitting alongside each other as though the problem had never been noticed. The second category of inconsistency is more complex, and in some ways more difficult to explain through ordinary error. Certain individuals named in the official account, people whose presence at specific events was described as direct and confirmed, appeared in other records from the same period at locations that made their simultaneous presence elsewhere physically very difficult, if not impossible. This kind of problem is not unheard of in historical records. Clerical errors occur. Names get confused with similar names. A person's location in one record might be misidentified. These are all legitimate explanations that should be considered before drawing stronger conclusions. But they become harder to apply when the same type of problem appears more than once, and when the individuals involved are the same ones whose presence was most central to the official account. The people who mattered most to the story are the ones whose documented locations raised the most questions. That concentration is difficult to explain through simple clerical confusion. The third category is perhaps the most technically specific, and it is the one that some researchers have found hardest to dismiss. Certain materials and details referenced in the official 1953 reports contained elements that, based on what is known about the development of relevant knowledge and technology in that period, were not yet available at the time the account was supposedly produced. These are what researchers sometimes call anachronistic elements, details that belong to a later period appearing in a document that claims to be from an earlier one. They are not always obvious. They are not the kind of thing a general reader would notice. They require specialized knowledge of the period to identify. But when they are identified, they create a serious problem for the document in which they appear. A genuine document from 1953 should not contain references to things that did not exist until 1955 or 1957. If it does, the explanation is either that the document was altered after the fact, or that it was not produced when it claims to have been. Neither explanation is comfortable. Both deserve serious consideration. At first, it seems reasonable to look at each of these inconsistencies separately and find an individual explanation for each one. A date error could be clerical. A location conflict could be a name confusion. An anachronistic detail could reflect a misidentification of the material in question, or an error in the research that identified it. Taken one at a time, each problem has at least one plausible ordinary explanation. But this is where the pattern becomes important, because the question is not whether any individual inconsistency can be individually explained. The question is whether all of them together, appearing in the same record, clustering around the same elements, consistently located in the same sections of the account, can be fully explained through the accumulation of separate, unrelated ordinary errors. That is a different question, and it is one that the ordinary error explanation handles much less convincingly. The location of the inconsistencies within the document is one of the most significant aspects of this problem. In a record containing errors introduced through general administrative carelessness, those errors tend to appear throughout the document without strong concentration in any particular area. They are distributed because the carelessness that produces them is distributed. No one part of the record was subjected to more or less attention than any other. But the inconsistencies in the 1953 documentation are not distributed in that way. They concentrate. They appear most heavily in the sections of the account that describe the most direct observations, the parts that record what specific people did, where they were, and what specific materials or developments were present. These are the sections that, in a well-produced official record, would receive the most careful attention. They are the sections where accuracy would be most important and most carefully checked, and they are exactly the sections showing the most problems. This is where the explanation starts to weaken, because if errors were the result of insufficient care, they should appear where care was insufficient, not where the greatest care would have been applied. Some researchers who examined these findings argued that they constituted archival noise, the normal background level of imperfection found in any large collection of historical documents. Their position was that researchers looking for problems will find them, because no archive is perfect and no record is entirely error-free. In this view, the inconsistencies in the 1953 documentation are not meaningful as a group, because they are not meaningfully different from the kinds of imperfections found elsewhere in records from the same period. This argument has some validity. It is true that archives contain errors. It is true that researchers focused on a specific question can develop a tendency to weight certain findings more heavily than the evidence warrants. These are genuine risks in this kind of work, and they deserve to be acknowledged. But there is a problem with applying this argument fully to the 1953 case. The archival noise explanation works when errors are random and distributed. It becomes less convincing when errors are consistent and concentrated. The noise in most archives does not systematically appear in the sections most central to the official claims of a document. If the errors in the 1953 record behaved like ordinary archival noise, they would be scattered. They are not. Others who examined the same findings took a different view. Their position was that the pattern was too consistent to be explained by coincidence or ordinary error. The concentration of inconsistencies in the most evidentially significant sections of the account, the appearance of potentially anachronistic details, the location conflicts involving the most central named individuals, taken together, they argued. This pattern suggested that the sections of the account relying most heavily on direct evidence were the sections with the weakest actual evidentiary foundation. That is a specific and significant claim. It does not say the entire account was fabricated. It says the parts of the account that should be most firmly grounded in direct observation are the parts that hold up least well under examination. And if that is accurate, it raises a question about what those sections of the account were actually based on, if not the direct evidence they implied. The disagreement between these two positions, archival noise versus meaningful pattern, has never been formally resolved. It remains an open question in the examination of the 1953 documentation. Researchers on both sides have continued to work from their respective frameworks, and neither has produced findings that fully convince the other. This is not unusual in historical research. Disagreements of this kind can persist for a long time, especially when the primary documentation is limited in availability or difficult to access independently. But the persistence of the disagreement is itself worth noting. If the inconsistencies were clearly explainable as ordinary error, the case for that explanation should have become stronger over time as more archival research was conducted. In most historical debates of this type, continued examination tends to gradually reduce the uncertainty. One interpretation accumulates more support, the other loses ground. The disagreement narrows. In this case, that narrowing has not occurred. The debate has remained genuinely open, and a debate that remains open after sustained examination suggests the evidence has not yet clearly favored either side. What this chapter establishes, then, is not a conclusion about the 1953 account. It is a clearer picture of the specific nature of the problems within it. The inconsistencies are real. They have been documented by researchers working from the primary sources. They are not evenly distributed across the record. They concentrate in the sections where accuracy should be highest. They include date conflicts, location contradictions involving central figures, and potentially anachronistic details that raise questions about when and how parts of the documentation were produced. Each of these elements carries some degree of uncertainty on its own. Individually, none forces a definitive conclusion, but collectively, they form a picture of a record that does not fully behave the way a well-produced, accurately documented official account should behave. And that picture, incomplete as it remains, is difficult to set aside entirely. It doesn't fully make sense that the sections of a carefully confirmed official record which show the most instability in precisely the places where direct evidence should be strongest. That instability has not been explained away. It has not been resolved through formal correction, and the question it raises about what those sections were actually based on continues to sit without a clear answer inside the 1953 documentation. The pattern was noticed, it was examined, it was debated, and it remains, for now, unresolved. Up to this point, the examination of the 1953 account has focused primarily on documents, on dates, on figures, on the internal consistency of official records and the structural problems found within them. That kind of evidence is familiar territory for historical investigation. It is concrete. It can be compared, cross-referenced, and evaluated against clear standards of what accurate documentation should look like. But at a certain point in any serious investigation, a different kind of evidence begins to appear. It is less tidy than documents. It is harder to categorize and harder to evaluate with precision. It is the evidence that comes from people, from individuals who were present during the events in question, or who claimed to be, and who eventually described what they experienced. And in the case of the 1953 account, this evidence introduces a layer of complexity that the documentary record alone does not provide. The personal accounts associated with the 1953 event did not surface all at once. That is the first thing worth understanding about them. They did not emerge through a coordinated effort or a formal process of testimony. They appeared slowly, over years, sometimes over decades. A statement here, made almost in passing during a conversation about something else. A detail there, added as a quiet correction to something that had been published. A description offered not for public record, but in a private context, later recalled by someone who had been present for it. This gradual, fragmented emergence is not unusual for accounts from that era. People who had been part of significant events, especially events connected in any way to official systems, did not always speak freely, or immediately, or completely. The political environment discouraged certain kinds of disclosure. Professional obligations created constraints, and the simple passage of time meant that accounts which might have been offered sooner were instead held, partially or entirely, until circumstances changed. The result is a body of personal testimony that arrived in pieces, across a long period, and required careful assembly before its significance could be assessed. When those pieces were assembled, something notable became visible. The accounts did not simply contradict the official version in obvious ways. They were not filled with dramatic alternative claims that directly challenged specific elements of the record. What they did instead was something quieter and, in some respects, more difficult to interpret. They described a version of events that was simply different in its shape, different in what it included, and most significantly, different in what it did not include. The official account of 1953 was built around certain specific elements. These elements were central to the story being told. They were the parts that gave the account its particular meaning and significance. Without them, the official version would not hold together in the same way. They were, in other words, the load-bearing parts of the narrative. And those are precisely the parts that the personal accounts consistently left out. This is where the investigation becomes genuinely difficult to navigate, because omission is not the same as contradiction. When a witness says something happened differently, that is a contradiction. It can be compared directly against the official version and evaluated. But when a witness describes an event without mentioning something the official record says was central to it, the interpretation is less straightforward. There are many reasons a person might omit something from their account. They may not have been in a position to observe it. Their attention may have been focused elsewhere. Memory, especially over time, is selective. It retains some things and loses others, and what it loses is not always the least important material. These are all legitimate explanations for individual omissions, but this is where it becomes unclear, because the omissions in this case were not individual. They were shared. Multiple people, describing the same general event from their own separate perspectives, left out the same specific elements, the elements the official account had placed at the center of its version. That kind of shared omission is harder to explain through individual limitations of perspective or memory. To understand why consistent omission across multiple independent accounts is significant, it helps to think about how witness accounts normally behave. When several people observe the same event and later describe it independently, their accounts will vary in many ways. They will emphasize different details. They will describe the same moments from different angles. They will use different language and organize their recollections differently. This variation is expected. It reflects the genuine differences in where each person was positioned, what drew their attention, and how their memory processed the experience. But within all that variation, the central elements of a significant event tend to appear consistently. If something important happened, something that would have been visible and significant to anyone present, most witnesses will mention it, even if they describe it differently. The presence of a central element in multiple independent accounts is one of the ways historians confirm that element actually occurred. The reverse logic also applies. When a central element is absent from multiple independent accounts, when people who were present consistently fail to mention something the official record describes as prominent, that absence carries weight. It suggests the possibility that those witnesses were not experiencing the event the official account described, that they were, in effect, working from a different version of reality. We're told to forget, and the long-term effects of operating within a framework of enforced discretion. In this view, the omissions in the personal accounts do not necessarily reflect a different underlying experience. They may reflect the effects of years of constraint on how those experiences could be expressed and recalled. A person who spent decades unable to speak freely about something may, when they finally do speak, produce an account that has been shaped by that long silence in ways they are not fully aware of. This explanation is also reasonable. It does not dismiss the personal accounts, but it complicates what can be concluded from them, and that complication is genuine. At first, it seems possible to resolve this by simply weighing the two explanations against each other and choosing the more convincing one. But there's a problem. Both explanations account for the same observable evidence, the consistent omissions, through different mechanisms. The evidence itself does not clearly favor one mechanism over the other. The omissions could reflect a genuinely different underlying experience. They could also reflect the long-term effects of constrained memory and expression. Without additional evidence that distinguishes between these possibilities, the personal accounts cannot be read with confidence in either direction. What they can do, more modestly, is add another layer to the picture that is already emerging from the documentary record. The documents showed structural inconsistencies. The timeline showed conflicts. The locations of named individuals raised questions. And now the personal accounts, fragmentary, delayed, and shaped by the conditions of their emergence, show a consistent pattern of omission centered on exactly the elements the official record emphasized most. Each of these layers, individually, leaves room for explanation, but collectively, they are building towards something that is increasingly difficult to account for through ordinary error, administrative imperfection, or the general unreliability of memory. The problems are appearing in too many different types of evidence, and they are concentrating around the same specific elements of the account, for that to feel entirely coincidental. This does not lead to a conclusion. The evidence, at this stage, does not support one, but it does change the character of the investigation. What began as a set of questions about documentation has now expanded into questions about experience, about what the people involved in the 1953 events actually observed, and whether that observation matches the story that was built around it. And this is where the explanation becomes most difficult, because if the personal accounts and the documentary record are both pointing toward the same gap between what was officially described and what was actually experienced, then the gap itself becomes the central question. Not just a question about errors in a record, but a question about the relationship between the official version of 1953 and the events it claimed to describe. That relationship has never been fully examined. The accounts remain partial. The omissions remain unexplained. And the consistency of what is missing, across documents, across timelines, and now across the personal testimony of people who were present, continues to raise a question that has no clean answer. What exactly were those people present for? And was it the same thing the official record says they witnessed? There is a particular kind of problem that becomes more significant the more times it appears. A single gap in a historical record can be explained. A single unanswered question can be set aside, attributed to the normal limitations of archival research, and moved past without too much difficulty. But when the same gap appears again, in a different examination, conducted by different people, using different methods, the explanation becomes harder to sustain. And when it appears a third time, and a fourth, always in the same place, always around the same details, the question of why it keeps appearing cannot be avoided any longer. This is the situation with the 1953 account. The inconsistencies identified in earlier examinations did not disappear as more research was conducted. They reappeared, consistently, in ways that have proven difficult to explain through the standard frameworks applied to historical record-keeping problems. To appreciate why this repetition matters, it helps to understand how historical investigation normally progresses. When researchers first examine a set of documents and find gaps or inconsistencies, those findings are considered preliminary. They are noted, but they are understood to reflect the limitations of an initial examination. The expectation is that further research, broader access to archives, more cross-referencing with related records, additional expertise applied to specific technical questions, will gradually fill the gaps and resolve the inconsistencies. This is how the process usually works. Early examinations identify problems. Later examinations address them. The record becomes more complete over time, and the questions that seem significant in early reviews either get answered or get explained in ways that reduce their significance. Progress in historical understanding is built, in large part, on exactly this kind of cumulative resolution. In the case of the 1953 account, that cumulative resolution has not occurred. The questions identified in early reviews were carried forward into later ones. Researchers who came to the material expecting to find answers to the problems their predecessors had noted instead found the same problems still present, still unresolved, still resistant to the standard methods of archival investigation. The timeline gaps are the most consistently reported of these recurring problems. In examination after examination, the same periods within the 1953 account show the same absence of supporting documentation. The record thins in the same places. The chain of evidence weakens at the same points. Researchers approaching the material from different angles, asking different specific questions, repeatedly arrive at the same areas of absence. This is not what random archival loss looks like. When records are lost through the ordinary processes of time, deterioration, misfiling, institutional disorganization, the losses are distributed unevenly, but without clear pattern. A collection might be missing records from a particular building that was damaged, or from a particular period when filing systems were in transition. The loss follows a physical or administrative logic. It does not follow the contours of a specific narrative, but the gaps in the 1953 documentation follow a narrative contour. They appear where the official account makes its strongest claims. They are absent where the account is most specific about what occurred. The physical and administrative explanations for archival loss do not account for that kind of targeted absence. The documentation thinning around specific details is equally consistent across examinations. It is not simply that some records are missing. It is that the records become sparse in a particular way, specifically around the elements of the account that would require the most direct evidence to support. The parts of the official story that depend most heavily on concrete, observable facts are the parts where the concrete, observable documentation is hardest to locate. At first, this seems like it could be explained by the general archival conditions of the era. Records from the early 1950s were not always well preserved. Institutions varied considerably in how carefully they maintained their documentation. Materials that were considered routine at the time were sometimes discarded, stored poorly, or simply lost as organizations changed and priorities shifted. But there is a problem with this explanation when applied uniformly. The thinning is not uniform. It is selective. Some areas of the 1953 documentation are well supported. The contextual materials, the background documents, the records that establish the general environment of the period. What is thin is the specific evidentiary core. And selective thinning, concentrated in the most evidentially important areas, does not fit the profile of general archival degradation. The pattern in witness divergence adds another dimension to this recurring problem. Across different examinations conducted at different times, researchers looking at personal accounts consistently found the same points of departure from the official record. The places where individual testimony failed to align with the official version were not random. They were the same places, identified again and again by researchers who in many cases were not aware of the specific findings of their predecessors. This convergence across independent research efforts is significant. It means the pattern of divergence is not an artifact of one particular researcher's approach or framework. It is not the result of one team asking leading questions or interpreting ambiguous evidence in a particular direction. Independent investigators, working separately, reach the same observations about the same points of conflict between personal accounts and official documentation. When independent researchers repeatedly arrive at the same specific findings without coordinating their work, the findings carry more weight than those produced by a single line of inquiry. The repetition itself becomes a form of evidence, not about what happened in 1953, but about where the weaknesses in the official account are consistently located. Some researchers who have noted this pattern of repetition argue that the explanation is straightforward, if somewhat unsatisfying. Their position is that the documentation from this period was simply poorer in specific areas, and that poor documentation in specific areas will naturally produce the same gaps every time researchers examine it. The repetition, in this view, reflects the stable condition of an incomplete archive, not any meaningful pattern in the incompleteness itself. This argument has genuine merit. Archives do not change between examinations. If a document is missing the first time a researcher looks for it, it will still be missing the 10th time. A gap that appears in one review will appear in every subsequent review, simply because the underlying absence is stable. From this perspective, the repetition of the same gaps across multiple examinations does not add information. It simply confirms what was already known about the state of the archive. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because this argument works well for random, distributed gaps. It works less well for gaps that are specifically concentrated around the most evidentially significant elements of an account. The question is not why the same gaps keep appearing. It is why the gaps are where they are in the first place. And that question, the argument about stable archival conditions, does not answer. The distinction between poor record keeping and deliberate gap creation is one that researchers in this area have approached carefully, and for good reason. It is a significant distinction. Poor record keeping is an institutional failure, common, understandable, and ultimately not indicative of intent. Deliberate gap creation is something different entirely. It implies that someone, at some point, made decisions about what would and would not remain in the accessible record. Proving deliberate gap creation is extremely difficult. The nature of such an action, if it occurred, would be to leave no trace of itself. A deliberately removed document does not announce its removal. A deliberately withheld piece of evidence does not leave a marker indicating that it was withheld. The absence looks the same whether it was produced by accident or by design. This is one of the fundamental challenges of this line of investigation. The evidence that would most definitively answer the question, evidence of deliberate action, is precisely the evidence that would be least likely to survive if the action was deliberate. So the investigation is left working with what remains. And what remains is a pattern of absence that fits neither ordinary archival loss nor the expectations of a well-documented official account. What makes the repetition of this pattern across examinations particularly worth examining is the variety of the researchers involved. These were not people working from the same institutional perspective or the same methodological framework. Some came from academic backgrounds, others from independent research. Some were focused specifically on the 1953 account. Others encountered it while investigating related topics and found the same problems by accident, so to speak, arriving at the gaps without specifically looking for them. That variety matters. It reduces the likelihood that the consistent findings reflect a shared bias or a shared methodological blind spot. When researchers with different starting points, different questions, and different methods all encounter the same pattern of weakness in the same locations, the pattern begins to look less like a product of how the research is being conducted and more like a genuine feature of the material being examined. And this is where the pattern raises its most persistent question. Is the clustering of gaps around specific elements of the 1953 account the result of poor record keeping that happened, by chance, to concentrate in the most important areas? Or does the specificity of the clustering suggest something more intentional, a set of decisions made at some point, about what the accessible record would and would not contain. The honest answer is that the evidence does not currently resolve this question. Both possibilities remain genuinely open. The pattern is real. Its cause is not established. And the gap between observing a pattern and explaining it is one that the available evidence has not yet been able to close. What can be said is this: the inconsistencies in the 1953 account are not artifacts of a single examination conducted from a particular angle. They are features of the record that have appeared repeatedly, across time, across researchers, and across methods. They are stable, they are specific, and they are concentrated in the places where the official account most needs support, and where that support is most consistently absent. That combination, stability, specificity, and concentration, does not resolve into a simple conclusion, but it does make the question of why the pattern exists considerably harder to set aside. The repetition is not noise. It is information. What exactly it is information about remains, for now, unclear. There's a point in any serious investigation where the scope of the problem begins to shift. What started as a set of questions about a specific account, its internal consistency, its evidentiary foundation, the reliability of its documentation, begins to reveal connections that extend beyond the original boundaries of the inquiry. The problem does not stay contained. It expands. And as it expands, the implications of the original questions grow alongside it. This is the point that the examination of the 1953 account has now reached. The questions about that account did not remain questions about a single event in a single year. They became questions about everything that was built on top of it. And what was built on top of it, it turns out, was considerably more than most people had reason to assume. To understand how this expansion works, it is necessary to think carefully about how official accounts function within larger systems of information. A single official account does not exist in isolation. From the moment it enters the record, it begins to connect. Other documents reference it. Other reports cite it as supporting evidence for their own conclusions. Analyses that address related topics assume its accuracy and build their reasoning on that assumption. Over time, the account becomes embedded, not just as one piece of information among many, but as a reference point that other pieces of information depend on. This is the normal process by which historical understanding is constructed. Each verified account becomes part of the foundation for the next layer of analysis. The system works well when the foundational accounts are accurate. It becomes problematic when they are not, because the inaccuracy does not remain in one place. It travels. It moves through every document that cited the original, into every conclusion that assumed the original was correct, and forward into the broader understanding of the period that those conclusions helped shape. The 1953 account was not a minor reference. It was not a peripheral detail that appeared occasionally in footnotes and had limited influence on broader conclusions. It was connected through citations, through official cross-references, through the reasoning of subsequent reports, to a framework of information that extended across multiple areas of understanding about that period. Events that came after 1953 referenced it. Analyses conducted years later assumed it as established background. Policy discussions that touched on related topics took it as a given. This means the reach of the original account was broader than its initial presentation suggested. At the time it entered the record, it appeared to be one account among many, significant, confirmed, and filed. What was less visible at the time was how extensively other parts of the record would come to depend on it, how frequently it would be cited, how deeply it would become woven into the reasoning of documents that addressed related questions. That visibility only becomes possible in retrospect, when the connections are traced backward from later documents to their sources, and those sources are followed back to the original 1953 account. Some researchers have begun doing exactly this work. Their approach is not to claim that the entire body of documentation built around the 1953 account is false. That would be a much larger claim than the evidence currently supports. Their approach is narrower and more methodical. They are asking a specific question. For each document or report that referenced the 1953 account as a source, how much of that document's reasoning depended on the 1953 account being accurate? In some cases, the answer is limited. The reference was peripheral. The document's conclusions did not rest heavily on the 1953 account, and even if that account contained inaccuracies, the document's broader findings would remain largely intact. In these cases, the connection exists, but its significance is contained. But in other cases, the dependence is more substantial. The 1953 account was not a peripheral reference, it was a central one. Conclusions were drawn directly from it. Subsequent events were interpreted through the framework it established. The reasoning of later documents assumed the 1953 account's accuracy at a foundational level, meaning that if the account was flawed, the reasoning built on it would carry those flaws forward, without any mechanism for catching or correcting them. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because information that enters a well-connected system of official records does not stay where it was placed. It moves through the system along the paths of citation and reference. A document that cites a flawed source becomes, in a small way, a carrier of that flaw. It passes the inaccuracy along to the documents that cite it in turn, and those documents pass it further still. In a transparent system, this kind of error propagation can be caught. Researchers examining later documents can trace their sources, identify where a flawed account entered the chain, and assess how much damage it did to the conclusions downstream. The chain can be broken, the flawed element can be identified, and the affected conclusions can be reconsidered. But the systems operating in and around 1953 were not fully transparent. Access to the foundational documents was limited. The citation chains were not always visible to outside researchers. The process of tracing an inaccuracy backward through layers of official documentation required access that was not consistently available, and so the potential propagation of any flaws in the original account was not easily detectable, even by careful researchers working in good faith. At first, this seems like a problem with a relatively clear boundary. If the 1953 account was flawed, and if those flaws traveled through the documents that cited it, then the scope of the problem should be roughly proportional to how frequently the account was cited and how centrally its accuracy featured in the reasoning of those documents. A problem with clear boundaries, even if those boundaries are wider than initially assumed, is at least a problem that can be mapped. But there's a problem with that framing. The connections between official documents from this period are not always direct or visible. Some documents cited the 1953 account explicitly, naming it as a source. Others drew on it indirectly, through intermediate documents that had already absorbed its framework and conclusions. And others may have been influenced by it without any traceable citation at all, simply because the account had shaped the general understanding of the period in ways that influenced how later analysts approached related questions. This indirect and informal influence is the hardest kind to trace. It leaves no clear citation path. It exists in the background assumptions of documents rather than in their explicit references. And background assumptions are, by their nature, the parts of a document least likely to be questioned or examined. The researchers who have been tracing these connections have described the work as slow and incomplete. The number of documents that reference the 1953 account, directly or indirectly, is larger than initial estimates suggested. Examining each connection carefully, determining how central the 1953 account was to each document's reasoning, and what the implications of a flawed source would be for each document's conclusions, requires detailed analysis of a large body of material. What has already been found is enough to establish that the reach of the original account was extensive. It touched more areas, was cited more frequently, and played a more foundational role in subsequent reasoning than the account's initial presentation would have implied. Whether that extensive reach means the implications of any potential flaw are proportionally large is still being assessed. This raises questions that the ongoing work has not yet answered. How many of the documents that built on the 1953 account were making conclusions that would be meaningfully affected by inaccuracies in their source? How many were peripheral enough in their dependence that the implications would be limited? And in the cases where the dependence was substantial, what were the conclusions that depended on it? And how far did those conclusions travel in turn? Some researchers have expressed caution about the direction this line of inquiry is heading. Their concern is not that the connections are being incorrectly identified, but that the implications being drawn from those connections are moving ahead of what the evidence actually supports. Identifying that document B cited document A does not establish that document B is unreliable. It establishes a connection, The reliability of document B depends on how central the 1953 account was to its reasoning, and that is a judgment that requires careful examination of each case individually. This caution is reasonable. The existence of connections between documents does not automatically transfer the problems of one document to all the others. The implications need to be assessed case by case, and that assessment has not been completed. Many of the connections have been identified. The implications of those specific connections are still being worked through. Others argue that the caution, while reasonable in principle, underestimates how foundational the 1953 account had become within the broader framework. Their position is that an account which is cited this frequently, and which played this central a role in the general understanding of the period, cannot have its potential inaccuracies treated as a contained problem. The connections are too numerous. The dependence is too deep. If the foundation was flawed, the structure built on it is more affected than a case-by-case analysis might suggest. Both of these positions reflect genuine uncertainty about the scope of the problem, and that uncertainty is appropriate, given where the investigation currently stands. The connections have been identified. Their full implications have not been resolved. The work of tracing them carefully, assessing their significance individually, and building a complete picture of how far the 1953 account's influence extended is ongoing and incomplete. What is clear is that the problem did not remain contained to 1953. The account connected to a broader framework. That framework was used to support subsequent conclusions, and those conclusions, in turn, shaped the understanding of a larger period of history in ways that are only now being examined with the specific question of the original account's reliability in mind. How far the flaws traveled, if they were flaws, a question the evidence has not yet fully resolved, remains unclear. The reach of the original account was broader than assumed. The implications of that reach are still being assessed, and the work of tracing the connections between a potentially imperfect original and the structure of understanding built on top of it is work that has only begun to produce findings. The question of scope remains open, and open questions about scope, in investigations of this kind, have a way of producing answers that are larger than anyone initially expected. After everything that has been examined, the documentary inconsistencies, the timeline gaps, the recurring patterns across multiple independent reviews, the personal accounts that omitted what the official record emphasized, and the broader reach of the account's influence, a reasonable expectation would be that researchers have by now arrived at a shared conclusion, that the accumulated evidence would have pointed clearly enough in one direction to produce at least a general consensus about what the 1953 account actually represents. That expectation has not been met. The researchers who have examined this case most carefully have not converged. They have diverged. They have arrived at genuinely different places, holding genuinely different interpretations of the same body of evidence. And that divergence, after this much sustained examination, is itself something that requires attention. The first position held by one group of researchers is the most direct in its implications. Their argument is that the 1953 account was deliberately constructed, not in the sense that every element was invented from nothing, and not necessarily through the coordinated effort of a single person or institution with a single clear objective, but constructed in the sense that the account reaching the public was the product of deliberate choices about what to include, what to emphasize, what to remove, and how to frame what remained. In this view, the process that produced the official account was not a straightforward process of observation and documentation. It was a process of assembly. Materials were selected. Details were arranged in a particular order. The resulting account reflected not simply what occurred, but what it was useful to have people believe had occurred. The event either did not happen in the way described, or the version that actually happened was sufficiently different from the official version that the two share only a surface resemblance. This is a significant position. It does not accuse any specific individual of a specific act of fabrication, but it does assert that the gap between the official account and the underlying reality was not accidental. It was produced, and that distinction between an account that is imprecise because of limitations and one that is shaped because of intent is the most consequential distinction in this entire investigation. The researchers holding this position point to several features of the evidence as support. The concentration of inconsistencies in the most evidentially significant sections of the account. The pattern of shared omissions in personal testimony. The specific rather than random character of the documentary gaps. And the smoothness of the account's initial acceptance. A smoothness they argue is more consistent with a carefully prepared narrative than with the normal, rough-edged process by which accurate accounts of real events typically enter the record. Each of these observations, they argue, is more easily explained by deliberate construction than by ordinary institutional failure. Ordinary failure produces random problems. Deliberate construction produces specific ones. And the problems in the 1953 account, in their assessment, are too specific and too consistently located to be adequately explained by chance or carelessness. But this position has gaps of its own. The most significant is the absence of direct evidence of the construction process itself. There is no document that records a decision to shape the account. There is no testimony from someone involved in producing it that confirms intent. The argument for deliberate construction rests on inference from the character of the problems, and inference, however well-reasoned, is not the same as evidence of intent. The second position is more cautious, and in some respects more difficult to dismiss. The researchers holding this view acknowledge that the inconsistencies are real. They do not argue that the problems in the documentation are insignificant or that the patterns identified across multiple examinations are imaginary. What they dispute is the interpretation of those problems. Their argument is that the inconsistencies, gaps, and patterns can be adequately explained through institutional failure, the kind of normal, systematic dysfunction that affects large bureaucracies operating under significant pressure with imperfect coordination and inconsistent record-keeping practices. In this view, the 1953 account was not deliberately constructed to mislead. It was imprecisely assembled by institutions that were doing their best under difficult conditions, and the imprecision reflects their limitations rather than their intentions. This explanation has real merit. The bureaucratic environment of the early 1950s was, by any reasonable assessment, one that produced imperfect documentation as a matter of routine. Departments did not coordinate seamlessly. Information moved slowly, and sometimes got distorted in transit. Records were created by people working under pressure, with limited time and incomplete information. The conditions for producing a poorly constructed but genuinely attempted account were present and active. At first, this explanation seems sufficient. It accounts for the inconsistencies, without requiring the more uncomfortable conclusion of deliberate construction. It fits within a known and well-documented pattern of institutional behavior from the period, and it does not demand evidence of intent, which the investigation has not produced. But there's a problem. The institutional failure explanation works best when the failures it produces are distributed in the way that institutional failures typically are, broadly, somewhat randomly, affecting peripheral details as readily as central ones. The failures in the 1953 account are not distributed that way. They concentrate. They appear specifically in the areas of greatest evidential importance, and that concentration is harder for the institutional failure explanation to account for. Institutional dysfunction does not typically produce failures that align neatly with the most sensitive parts of an account while leaving the less sensitive parts relatively intact. If carelessness and poor coordination were responsible, the problems should be scattered more evenly. The fact that they are not leaves a question that the institutional failure explanation has not fully answered. The third interpretation occupies a different space from either of the first two. It does not claim deliberate fabrication, and it does not rest primarily on institutional failure. Instead, it proposes that the truth of the 1953 account lies somewhere between what was officially described and what would have been described if the account had been produced without any shaping at all. In this view, something did occur in 1953. An event happened. It had real elements that were observed by real people. But the process by which that event was converted into an official account involved enough reframing, enough selection, emphasis, and adjustment that the official version and the actual event share only partial resemblance. The account is not an invention, but it is not an accurate description either. It is somewhere in between. This interpretation has an intuitive appeal because it acknowledges complexity without requiring the strongest claims of either other position. It accepts that the event was real without accepting that the official account of it is reliable. It explains the personal testimony that omitted central official elements, because those elements may genuinely have been absent from the experience of people present, having been added or emphasized in the process of reframing. And it accounts for the documentary inconsistencies as the natural residue of an assembly process that was working from real but partially different material. The gap in this interpretation is different from the gaps in the first two. It does not require evidence of deliberate intent, and it does not require the inconsistencies to be distributed in a particular way. But it does require a specific kind of process to have occurred, one in which an event was observed, documented initially in a relatively accurate form, and then reframed significantly enough to produce the official account. That process would have involved multiple steps and multiple decisions, and evidence of that process, like evidence of deliberate construction, has not been clearly identified in the available record. This is where the explanation becomes difficult. All three interpretations identify a gap between the official account and what the evidence suggests actually occurred. They differ primarily in how they explain the origin and nature of that gap, and the explanation for the gap's origin is precisely what the available evidence cannot currently determine. What is particularly notable about this three-way disagreement is who is having it. These are not fringe positions held by researchers working from limited or questionable sources. The people holding each of these interpretations have worked from primary documents. They have examined the archival record directly. They have applied serious methodological standards to their analysis, and they have still ended up in genuinely different places. This matters because it changes what can be concluded from the disagreement itself. When serious researchers working carefully from primary sources reach different conclusions, the disagreement is informative. It suggests the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, that it does not clearly favor one interpretation over the others, and evidence that is genuinely ambiguous after sustained. Careful examination is evidence that has not yet been adequately understood. Some believe the disagreement will eventually resolve as more archival material becomes accessible and more connections are traced. Others are less optimistic. They argue that the parts of the record most relevant to resolving the disagreement are precisely the parts that are most difficult to access, and that the difficulty of access may itself be a feature of the situation rather than a coincidence. Neither optimism nor pessimism about eventual resolution changes the current state of the investigation. Right now, three serious interpretations of the same evidence coexist, without any of them having been confirmed or fully dismissed. Each has supporting observations. Each has unanswered questions. Each makes sense of some of the evidence, while leaving other parts of it less well explained. It doesn't fully make sense that an account which was presented with such apparent certainty, confirmed, verified, and officially filed, would, after serious examination, produce this level of interpretive disagreement among careful researchers. The certainty of the original presentation and the uncertainty of the current state of understanding are difficult to reconcile. But that difficulty is the situation. The official account said the matter was settled. The investigation suggests it is not, and the three interpretations currently held by serious researchers represent the honest state of an inquiry that has found real problems without yet finding definitive answers. Where those answers will eventually come from, if they come at all, is not clear. The evidence available has been examined carefully and has produced genuine disagreement rather than resolution. What additional evidence might exist, where it might be found, and whether it would be sufficient to distinguish clearly between the three interpretations on the table. These are questions that the investigation has not yet been able to answer. What can be said is that the answer is not as simple as the official record once made it appear. The researchers who have looked most carefully at the 1953 account have not confirmed its reliability. They have complicated it, and complications of this depth, produced by this quality of examination, do not resolve quickly or easily. The disagreement continues, and so does the question. There is a particular kind of ending that investigations sometimes reach, not the ending that was hoped for, and not the one that feels satisfying, but the one that is honest. It is the ending where the work has been done carefully. The evidence has been examined seriously, and the result is not a clear answer, but a clearer understanding of why the answer remains out of reach. This kind of ending is uncomfortable. It does not resolve the tension that careful investigation creates. but it is, in many cases, the most accurate place to stop. The examination of the 1953 account has reached exactly this kind of ending, not because the investigation was incomplete or poorly conducted, but because the evidence, examined as carefully as it can be with what is currently accessible, does not support a final conclusion in any direction. What it supports is something more modest and, in its own way, more significant. A clear picture of what remains unknown and why. The timeline has been examined. The internal chronology of the 1953 account was found to contain conflicts, dates that did not align across sources, sequences that did not hold together under cross-referencing. Those conflicts were documented. They were noted across multiple independent examinations. They were never formally reconciled within the official record. The timeline, as it stands in the accessible documentation, contains gaps and inconsistencies that have not been explained away. The documents themselves were examined. Their internal consistency was found to be weaker than the language of the official account implied. The most evidentially important sections showed the most instability. Anachronistic elements appeared in places they should not have been. The evidentiary foundation of the account, when examined closely rather than taken at face value, did not fully support the certainty with which the account was originally presented. The witnesses were examined. Their accounts emerged slowly, in pieces, over years and decades. And what was most notable about them was not what they said, but what they consistently did not say. The same central elements, omitted across multiple independent accounts, in ways that were difficult to attribute entirely to the ordinary limitations of memory and perspective. The patterns were examined. The same categories of problems appeared across multiple independent reviews, conducted at different times by different researchers. The repetition of those problems, in the same specific locations within the record, resisted explanation through ordinary archival degradation or institutional carelessness. The connections were examined. The 1953 account was found to be more deeply embedded in the broader record than its initial presentation suggested, cited more frequently, depended upon more substantially, and therefore potentially more consequential in its unreliability than anyone initially assumed. And the interpretations were examined. Serious researchers, working from primary sources, arrived at three genuinely different positions: deliberate construction, institutional failure, and significant reframing, none of which has been confirmed, and none of which has been dismissed. After all of that examination, one thing is clear. It is not a conclusion about what happened in 1953. It is the recognition that such a conclusion is not currently available. The investigation has been thorough enough to establish that the official account is not as reliable as it was presented. It has not been thorough enough, or the accessible evidence has not been complete enough, to establish what a more accurate account would look like. This absence of conclusion is not a failure of the investigation. It is a finding. It tells us something specific and important, that the 1953 account, despite its official status and its decades of unchallenged presence in the historical record, has not survived careful examination in the way that a well-founded account should. It has resisted resolution not because it is clearly true and the challenges to it are inadequate, but because the challenges have genuine substance and the account has not been able to absorb them. The official record, for its part, remains unchanged. The 1953 account sits in the archive as it always has. It has not been formally revised. No official body has issued a correction or an acknowledgement of the problems that researchers have identified. The inconsistencies documented across multiple examinations are not reflected in any formal update to the record. The account continues to exist in its original form, carrying its original presentation of certainty, as though the examination of the past several decades had not occurred. This is not unusual. Official records are rarely revised in response to academic or independent research, even when that research identifies significant problems. The processes by which official accounts are created and the processes by which they might be corrected operate on different timescales and respond to different pressures. A researcher identifying an inconsistency in an archived document does not automatically trigger a formal review. The institutional mechanisms for that kind of correction are slow, limited, and often require a level of political or institutional motivation that independent research alone does not generate. But the absence of official revision does not mean the problems have been resolved. It means they have not been formally acknowledged. Those are two very different things. And the gap between formal acknowledgement and actual resolution is one of the more uncomfortable features of where this investigation currently stands. Some would say that this is simply how history works, that the messy, incomplete, never fully resolved character of the 1953 case is not exceptional. It is the normal condition of historical knowledge. Most events from that era carry some degree of unresolved uncertainty. Most official accounts from that period contain imperfections that careful examination reveals. The 1953 account is not unique in having problems. It is simply one of many records from a complicated period that deserves more careful scrutiny than it has historically received. This view is reasonable. It places the 1953 case within a larger context of historical imperfection and reminds us that demanding complete resolution from any historical account is setting a standard that most accounts cannot meet. Some uncertainty is the normal condition of working with records from the past. Accepting that uncertainty without overstating its implications is part of responsible historical thinking. But this is where it becomes unclear, because not all uncertainty is the same. There is a difference between the ordinary incompleteness of a historical record, the gaps that result from the passage of time, the loss of documents, the fading of memory, and the specific, patterned, concentrated uncertainty found in the 1953 account. The first kind is expected and unremarkable. The second kind raises questions that the passage of time explanation does not adequately address. Others take a different view of what the current state of the investigation implies. Their position is that the specific nature of the inconsistencies, the way they cluster, the way they repeat, the way they concentrate in the most evidentially significant parts of the account, points to something that warrants more formal examination than it has received. Not more independent academic research, which has already been conducted to a significant degree, but formal institutional examination, an official review that would bring access to restricted materials, compel the production of relevant documentation, and produce findings with institutional authority behind them. Whether such an examination is possible, or likely, is a different question. The institutional motivation for a formal review of a decades-old account that is already in the official record would need to come from somewhere, and the sources of that motivation are not currently visible. But the argument that the evidence meets the threshold for formal re-examination is one that has been made seriously by people working seriously with the available material. The disagreement between those who see the 1953 case as ordinary historical imperfection and those who see it as something requiring formal institutional attention has not been resolved. Both positions are still being held. Both are still being argued, and neither has fully persuaded the other. What the investigation leaves behind, then, is a set of open questions that have been more precisely defined through examination, but not answered. The questions about the timeline, the documentation, the witness accounts, and the patterns of recurring inconsistency are now better understood than they were before careful examination was applied. The nature of the problems is clearer. The locations of the gaps are more specifically identified. The competing interpretations have been articulated more precisely, but the questions themselves remain open. Which version of the core facts was accurate? What accounts for the concentration of inconsistencies in the most evidentially important sections? Why have the problems identified across multiple examinations never been formally addressed? What do the consistent omissions in personal testimony actually reflect about the experience of people who were present? And most fundamentally, what actually happened in 1953? And how different was it from the account that entered the official record? None of these questions has a current answer. All of them have been asked carefully and have not yet received answers that are supported by sufficient evidence to be considered established. It doesn't fully make sense that a story presented with such apparent certainty, officially confirmed, publicly circulated, and accepted without serious challenge, would arrive at this point in such an unresolved state. The confidence of the original presentation and the depth of the current uncertainty are genuinely difficult to reconcile. If the account was as well-founded as it claimed to be, careful examination should have confirmed it. Instead, careful examination has produced sustained disagreement about its reliability, without producing the evidence needed to resolve that disagreement in either direction. That gap between original confidence and current uncertainty is perhaps the most honest summary of where the 1953 account stands. It was presented as settled. It has not remained settled. And the reasons it has not remained settled are not trivial. They reflect real problems in the documentation, real patterns in the evidence, and real disagreement among people who have examined the material as carefully as the available access allows. Perhaps the most accurate place to leave this is not with a conclusion, but with a recognition. The recognition that the 1953 story, whatever it was, whatever actually occurred, and whatever the relationship is between those events and the account that entered the official record, has not yet been fully explained. The examination has clarified what is uncertain. It has not resolved what is unknown. The conversation around the 1953 account has not ended. It continues among researchers who disagree about what the evidence means. It continues in archives where relevant documents may exist, but have not yet been examined. It continues in the space between what was officially said and what careful investigation has found. Whether that conversation will eventually produce resolution, whether the questions that have been more precisely defined through examination will one day receive answers supported by sufficient evidence, remains genuinely uncertain. The evidence needed for resolution may exist somewhere in the record. It may not. The access required to find it may eventually become available. It may not. What is certain is that the question remains open, and open questions, honestly held, are sometimes the most important place an investigation can leave us.